Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Thank you for being here. Apologies for the slightly late start, but the Gastown Grand Prix, I hope some of you caught sight of them whizzing by, is on right now. So we just wanted to give people a chance to settle down. We're so happy to be here in this theater where the projection facilities are amazing so that you can see these artists work rather than the more intimate and more aptly named World Art Studio next door. I'd really like to thank you for being here. We're looking forward to seeing these three amazing artists in conversation with Charlie Smith shortly. But first, I'd really like to warmly thank the people who've supported this event, and the major supporters of this event are the Hari Sharma Foundation, who are responsible for Orijit Sen traveling here from India, and for Michael Yahgulanaas coming down to be with us. And we're so proud to have their support. And I'd like to ask Chin Banerjee, the president of the foundation, to just say a few words of welcome before we start.
Thank you, Sirish. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all warmly on behalf of Hari Sharma Foundation to this wonderful event. I'll say that when Sirish first mentioned this, I said, look, this is very exciting. I'm very, very excited about this, but you got to send an application and so forth for our formal process, which it did, and it took us, I think, about 5 minutes to decide that yes, we want to support this program. This is a very exciting program, Sirish. I want to congratulate you, Indian Summer, the board of Indian Summer, for being so creative, thoughtful in organizing, bringing so many good things to us, but this one is certainly a very, very beautiful and exciting program. Thank you. And to say who we are, just a few words about Hari Sharma Foundation. This is, I was talking to the Consul General of India, who asked me, who is Hari Sharma? What is Hari Sharma Foundation? So I should explain to you who we are. My colleague, Dr. Hari Sharma, was a professor of sociology at Simon Fraser University. He passed away in 2010, but he left his estate to a foundation. He formed a foundation, Hari Sharma Foundation, and he left his estate to it with the mandate of the advancement of South Asian community, promoting its culture, facilitating its artists, and scholarship in regard to South Asia and the South Asian diaspora. We give scholarships, graduate scholarship to Simon Fraser University. We give labor studies grants. We give grants for PhD students doing research and writing, getting stuck at the last minute without any funding, and we come to the rescue and fund them. We have funded people going to India to work on informal workers, domestic workers, and so on. This is the sort of thing we do, along with we funding films, exciting films about South Asia by South Asian members of the South Asian diaspora, or actually others who have wanted to make very interesting films about South Asia. We have given grants for that. So this is the kind of thing we do, and this program is certainly, I think, one of the things that made us happiest in supporting. Thank you very much. Enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Chin. Artists and researchers in the audience, take note. Never has a grant or application fallen on such prompt and gleeful ears. So I wish it was all like that. There's a few special people in the audience. Chin already mentioned Consul General Ravi Aisola, and also his wonderful wife Preeti, who's herself a writer and whose book is actually on display here. So please take a look at it. Also like to recognize two very special guests all the way from Mumbai, Subodh Sangle and Kiran Gawande from the Dabbawalas Association. I'm so happy that they're here in the audience tonight. Just got off the plane and already immersing themselves in the cultural life of Vancouver. They'll be speaking in this auditorium tomorrow. Also like to recognize Neelamjit Dillon, sitting up there in the back, a wonderful, wonderful musician. Neil's back there. We all had the privilege of listening to him earlier this week. And with that, I'd just like to invite Charlie Smith, who'll be moderating the session, to come and call up the artists one by one, who will show us their work and speak to us first, and then they'll go into a conversation. Charlie has been a major support with the Georgia Strait, and many of you would have seen it. We're so thankful, Charlie, to everything you've done to help this festival along. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh. I just want to mention I have an article about the Dabawalas I interviewed on Strait.com if you're interested in learning more. It's an honor to be at an event supported by the Hari Sharma Foundation. I want to just say a couple of words about Hari Sharma myself. He's taught me a great deal about partition, about secularism in India, and I know he inspired a generation of young people of South Asian descent, and his work is carrying on in our community every week of the year. And I just want to give an applause to Hari Sharma. And it's too bad he can't be here tonight, because I think he'd be thrilled by the panel that we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each artist up one at a time, and they're going to talk about their work, and then we'll engage in some conversation, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Our first speaker, Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas, he was raised in Haida Gwaii, and his art has been shown in museums around the world, including the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, where he had a big show in 2007, and the British Museum. He was the ordained professor in contemporary arts of the Pacific Northwest at the University of Victoria in 2011-2012. So we're talking about he's a major artist, but that'll be clear from the work he shows. He's interested in how art collections define cultures, both of the colonized and the colonizing. He has a long record of defending Indigenous rights and culture and the environment on Haida Gwaii, which is our islands off northwestern BC. He's achieved a stellar reputation for his Haida manga graphic books, but he's also a public artist, having created a 43-meter steel sculpture of two orcas alongside Kensington Park. He's the author of several publications, including Old Growth, the canoe he called Luntas, and Red, a Haida manga. In addition, he illustrated David Suzuki's The Declaration of Interdependence, a pledge to planet Earth. And David Suzuki has a long history with the Haida people. So I'm very pleased to introduce Michael to Indian Summer. So with no further ado, the podium is yours. Let's give him a warm welcome.
You know, one of the things about Indigenous peoples is we've been called many names by many people. We used to be called Indians, and I think now we're called First Nations. And I kind of like the term Indian. And I have to say that I feel quite at home here. So it's really good to see you. I think there is some sense of solidarity between your nation and Indigenous peoples, particularly here in the West Coast. I think it arises out of our common experience as people who have suffered the rather caustic embrace of the British Crown. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. I was asked to prepare some audiovisual material, and I think it's probably out there somewhere, and I'm going to show you two examples, essentially. And one is called The Flight of the Hummingbird. It's a book that I did a few years ago, and the foreword is written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So let's go back to the beginning. And we'll play a little bit of sound here, and then we're going to go into the second piece, which is called Red Ahidamanga. And I want to talk a little bit about Red Ahidamanga when it comes on there, and then we'll play a little bit of the music that's associated with that. But I just want to talk a moment about the flight of the hummingbird. The flight of the hummingbird is a parable that comes from South America. And the parable, when we published first in Japan, it was received quite well, actually. I think we went to number 3 bestseller one morning. We sold 20,000 copies one day, and but those are the numbers. But what I was really struck about was a small city in southern Japan. There was a particular temple where people started taking pieces of paper and writing pledges, and then they would paste it on the wall, and the whole wall was fluttering with the breeze. And it's the story. When we published in Japan, it was 10 sentences long. When we got to Canada, the publisher said, Michael, nobody's going to pay $16 for a book that's 10 sentences. You got to pump it up. I was too young to say no at that time. Now I think I would say no. But the story is, the forest was on fire, and all the animals fled except a hummingbird, which flew back to a small stream and picked up a bead of water and dropped it over the fire, and flew back again and again, a tiny bead of water over this great fire, until the bear finally said to the hummingbird, "What are you doing? Stupid? What?" And the hummingbird said, "I do what I can." And I think in terms of, Charlie has asked that we speak about our art, and I think for me, that's a real key principle here. I don't know if my art makes any difference. I don't know if it really makes any contribution to a more peaceful relationship between people. I don't know if it helps inspire us to rise up and try and put the fires that burn so deeply and so in such a hurtful way in our lives in different ways. But it seems like just doing what I can. So we're going to run the Fly the Hummingbird, the first little part, and if somebody up there can see me at some point, I may wave and say, let's just stop it, so that we don't go on at great length, because of course we have our friends, and then we'll do Red.
Here is the story of the great forest that caught on fire. The terrible fire raged and burned. All of the animals were afraid and fled from their homes. The elephant and the tiger, the beaver and the bear all ran, and above them the birds flew in a panic. They huddled at the edge of the forest and watched. All of the creatures gathered, except one. Only Dukduktium, the little hummingbird, would not abandon the forest. Dukduktium flew quickly to the stream. She picked up a single drop of water in her beak. Dukduktium flew back and dropped the water on the fire. Again, she flew to the stream and brought back another drop, and so she continued, back and forth, back and forth. The other animals watched Dukduktium's tiny body fly against the enormous fire, and they were frightened. They called out to the little hummingbird, warning her of the dangers of the smoke and the heat. "What can I do?" sobbed the rabbit. "This fire's much too hot. There's too much smoke," howled the wolf. "My wings will burn. My beak is too small," cried the owl. But the little hummingbird persisted. She flew to and fro, picking up more water and dropping it, bead by bead, onto the burning forest. Finally, the big bear said, "Little Dukduktium, what are you doing?" Without stopping, Dukduktium looked down at all of the animals. She said, "I'm doing what I can."
Thank you. The animation is based on my drawings, but the animation is done by my nephew, Chris Octor. Flight of the Hummingbird really speaks in a very deep way to the structure of my particular community, the Haida Nation. And it is quite different than that, I think, of the Canadian, of how Canadian society is structured. In a Haida society, we have notions of the individual's duty to be engaged in the day-to-day decisions of the community. There is a word chief which is used to describe the political structure of my indigenous community, the Haida, and it's really quite misleading. It's so difficult to take concepts and translate them across through cultural and ethnic borders. They don't just translate very easily. It is not a Western king with ultimate powers who resides in a castle on top of the hill who will come down, and if he wants your son for war, he will take your son. Or if he wants your daughter, he will take your daughter. Or if he wants your fatted sheep, he will take your sheep. It's not like that in indigenous society. We do not, in our leadership, we do not have the power to compel. We cajole, we seduce, we earn, we trade our rights to sit, if we will, at the podium, totally dependent on the support of the people in the community, and that support can be withdrawn any time. So decision-making is quite complicated, but it's also quite intimate, and it's not an imposition. Now, the next one I want to show you, Red, a Haida manga, is a true story, and it's true. Red, the hero in the story, is a leader. I will explain it, perhaps. I'm not sure if I'll run the whole tape. I think it's 4 minutes. That would be far too long. But Red is a leader who is blinded by revenge and power, and he is ultimately taken down by the community. And it's my family that actually cut his head off. And it was the response to a leader who had gone too far and had involved the community in too many wars. And at the time that I was working on this, that fellow, George Bush, decided that he had to start a war in the Middle East. And it was quite a difficult period for me as I was working with this particular story. And as you will see, it's quite... I thought it was quite a large piece until I saw your piece, and I realized that I have made a baby mural, and so we will see. But the problem that I found was dealing with scale. You know, it was 5 meters long, and in order to see that, I had to fashion it on the studio wall and then go out in the garden and peer through the window, and then of course I had to get close and intimate with it. And so it was almost working like at a microscopic level. So it was really a very interesting time for me, and I think the work. Let's play the piece, please. Good. I had asked them to stop it at 2 minutes, and I was turning on my phone to try and track it and realized there was no way I could. So thank you very much. You can see this is the actual size of the pieces. Each piece, a sheet of paper behind me is an 18 by 22 inch sheet of paper, which divides down into 6 separate compartments, each compartment being a page in the book. The whole piece was designed so that readers could take 2 copies of the book and cut it up. And I know that the librarians are quite distressed with me, but honest, we can make more books. Don't worry about it. It's not like an original object. And the idea is to try and encourage people to become more engaged, much as the Hummingbird says, I do what I can. I want people to actually see themselves as artists and as people who are constructing new visions of the world. And once you fit two books together, you can actually create a mural that's about 3 meters long. A few people have actually done that. And we're gonna end with just the music by Chris Dirksen.
That was wonderful, Michael. Thank you. I know Hari Sharma was an admirer of Arundhati Roy, who was in Vancouver not too long ago. And as I introduce Delhi-based Orijit Sen, he is to graphic art in India what Arundhati Roy is to words. He's an activist. His 1994 fictionalized book, River of Stories, is an account of resistance to a huge dam project in Gujarat. As our writer John Lucas pointed out in an article last week, Orijit's book was published 7 years before Joe Sacco's Palestine, kind of really implanted graphic journalism in the minds of the West. Joe Sacco, I actually interviewed him here, and he did one of these big books that Michael just described about the First World War. And Orijit's work kind of is reminiscent of that and others. Since then, he's created the Punjab mural, and you can see a smaller version, which is still huge, in the Woodward's atrium. It's 20 meters by 75 meters, and it's magnificent, inspired by a Mughal painting. And, you know, it's drawn comparisons between him and Michelangelo. So we're in the presence of greatness. And he's laughing and being humble, but this is actually what people are talking about. He's a phenomenal artist. And if there's any question, you just have to go down to the Woodward's atrium and you can see it. So I could go on and on and on, but he's come all the way from Delhi. So I'm going to cede the podium to Orijit Sen, and welcome to Vancouver. Let's give him a very warm Vancouver welcome.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here. I think I have a bunch of things I want to share with all of you, and so there'll be time to talk later, but I just want to go through the images that I want to share with you. I'd like to begin with some pages from a work called Hair Burns Like Grass. It's a graphic novel based on, or rather inspired by, the poetry of Kabir, but it's a fictional work, and it's a work in which I've tried to combine poetry. Kabir was a 15th century Sufi Bhakti poet from India, and he's extremely you'll get a chance to read some of his poetry now in the pages of my book. Very, very contemporary. Amazingly contemporary. He's like a modern poet writing in the 15th century. But let's go, Jessica. I've combined the poetry in its original. Kabir was actually illiterate, and so his poetry was only written down, at least a couple of centuries after he died. So what we have as originals are,
not really originals. They're what finally got handed down by oral through the oral tradition, and were written down sometime in the 17th century. So anyway, I'll read out the Hindi bits. Can we go back one sec? Yeah. This one goes, मोको कहाँ ढूंढे रे बंदे, मैं तो तेरे पास में, ना तीरथ में, ना मूरत में, ना एकांत निवास में. मैं तो तेरे पास में बंदे, मैं तो तेरे पास में. I mean, basically he goes on to sort of describe the sense of being connected to the infinite and the absolute, and he takes the voice of this absolute spirit and says, where are you looking for me? I'm right here with you. You don't need to go looking in the mountains and in the temples and in places of worship, because I'm with you all the time. And I've used the poetry on a fictional narrative about an old man who's dying. So, and it's a kind of series of flashbacks on his life, informed by the poetry. Next one, Jessica. Yeah, and also what I've done in this book is work on this kind of shift between a kind of fictional narrative of this unnamed protagonist, and kind of because Kabir is such a very seminal and very, very kind of interesting figure, it's very hard to pin him down historically. We have so little information, and yet we have so much poetry from him, that I have a kind of a simultaneous narrative that like a kind of commentary about Kabir's life and about the controversy surrounding him. So the book moves between these two threads, between this fictional story and a kind of a historical and social commentary around Kabir. He lived in Varanasi, what we call Varanasi. In his time, he called it Kashi. And this old man, he lives in this city of Gurgaon, which is this very super modern 21st century, quite crazy kind of a city in India. Okay, next. And the story kind of revolves around his interactions with a woman who's taking care of him. She could be his daughter. Again, I've deliberately kept the relationships and the characters very, very open, not defining who they are or even their names. But next. I hope you can read the text, but we won't be able to go through with the detailed reading, but just to give you a sense. Next. Here you see the poem I was reading out in the beginning in the Devanagari text. I have the English translation of this here. So I've kind of, so that it becomes accessible to people, but it's not like a word-to-word translation, or it's not like they appear next to each other. But essentially you can read it in both languages, or you can read it only in English as well. And this is kind of scene of a typical gathering. Kabir is still sung in village gatherings. The poetry of Kabir informs. It's a very, very folk kind of tradition, and it's a very fascinating tradition where people gather at nights. Sometimes they have night-long sessions of singing and sharing the poetry. So this is like a scene from a typical Kabir gathering. Next. And if you notice, for example, in the lower frame there, where this man is being wheeled out and he's imagining he's on a motorbike, you see the text, the text of the poetry appears everywhere. It's hidden in the imagery. It's in the railing of, where he's being wheeled along the wheelchair. The railing is composed of the text of the poetry. So, in a sense, Kabir's poetry is like that. It lives among the trees and the streets and the sidewalks and the buildings, and that's what I kind of want to sort of bring in. can I go back one sec? I just want to, the woman, she's holding a lotus, like a little lotus pond in her hands, and the paisley print of her sari is kind of flying out of the frame. And when we go to the next page, the print turns around the page and becomes actually legends of Kabir. What I find very interesting is where there are no histories, where we don't have documented and agreed upon notions, and Kabir is one such figure. There are lots of stories and legends that come in to occupy that space, where that space left blank by historical scholarship or authoritative versions. And these images here are all images from the many different traditions and stories and legends around Kabir. They refer to all the multitude of kind of folk cultures that Kabir was part of. Next. This carries on with one of the birth legends of Kabir, and the most interesting thing is about Kabir, among so many other things which you don't know, we don't know whether he was Hindu or Muslim. And this is something that Hindus and Muslims have both claimed Kabir. And Kabir himself mocks, even in his own words, you see that mockery when he says, na Hindu hu, na Musalman, Musalman to hu nahi. Basically, that he says that I'm neither Hindu nor Muslim, but I play in both. I revel in the sort of existence of both, and yet I am neither. And so the birth legends actually try to locate him in one tradition or the other. And the one I chose is an interesting one because it sort of places him as being born from a Hindu mother, but then sort of abandoned and rescued by a Muslim couple, and hence it gives him this kind of dual identity. Okay, next. Just a word about some of the metaphors, like the cutting of the kite. Kites are flown in India during particular festivals, and they have fights where the strings of the two kites of the duelists will kind of entangle, and one of them will cut the other one. And here, I mean, it's very, very. So here, this is a view of the Ganga and Banaras, and we see the kite flying that's going on. But at the same moment, the protagonist. This is like Varanasi in the 1930s, let's say. The same old man, it's his kind of childhood. And at the moment he discovers that his mother has died, the flying kite gets cut, and it's kind of refers to this very strong moment in his life. Next. The Varanasi, and in Hindu families they shave the head when somebody in the family dies, and he goes to light the funeral pyre of his mother. Okay, next. 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 Kabir's poetry appears like in the form of moths. Next. Okay, next. So I'll leave it there because it's part of a longer work. Now I'd like to show you something in a very different vein. This is mostly a non-textual narrative. I really like working with just narratives which are primarily visual. This is a character I created called P.R. Mazumdar. And he's a Bengali like me. And Bengalis have this well-known sort of fear of cold weather, and so you'll find Bengalis in Calcutta, even though it's really quite warm there even in winter, they wear these caps which they call monkey caps. They're like balaklavas, and it's a really popular Bengali thing. And so I made this character Mazumdar, who's a scientist and traveler, and he's also the legendary inventor of the monkey cap. Each of Mazumdar's stories end with a little moral, and so he traveled. This was inspired, of course, by Rajasthan, about time I spent in Shekhawati, which is so. I really am very involved with geography. I really love to kind of create sort of spaces and in which one can kind of locate things. Okay, now I'm running out of time, so I'll quickly run through the next one and then we should move on because I'm waiting to see David's great work. This is a series of posters, screen prints I've done recently, which are intended to sort of look at the kind of the idea of political posters and how they're kind of vanishing from our public spaces. This was part of a show in a gallery in Bangalore, and I'll show you a few of them. I don't know how many of you can read Hindi, but Mali means gardener in Hindi. And I've put Mahatma Gandhi's words in his mouth, except I've changed. This is Mahatma Gandhi's very famous quotation: "There's enough in the world for everyone's need, but not for anyone's greed." And I changed that to weed. Okay, next. And okay, next. This is, of course, a take on the Helen of Troy story. But, of course, instead of Greek soldiers, they're Indian soldiers. Okay, next. This refers to a very, very important fight that a tribal community, Adivasi community in Niyamgiri is fighting in Orissa, and the Supreme Court. I was just talking to Charlie just now about the rulings over here about the ownership of land, and this is exactly a very parallel situation where a particular hill has been acknowledged by the Supreme Court as that the tribal people who live on that hill in Orissa, they own it, and they can decide whether one of the world's largest mining companies who've been given rights to mine that place, but they can decide whether they should or not. And recently, unanimously, the tribal community, council of the community voted against the mining, and they've defeated them. So this was a poster to kind of inform people about it. You see the website. These are the guys who I did this for, and to let people know that it's possible to win against giant corporations. Just a handful, a small community of tribal people fighting them. Okay, next. This is a campaign for the release of Vinayak Sen, and which was used extensively during the campaign. Dr. Vinayak Sen was arrested on charges of being a supporter and facilitator for the Maoists, which the government of India is waging a war against. And but there was a concerted campaign, and I was very involved with it, and I'm happy to say that we won, and Dr. Vinayak Sen is free again. Okay, next. This is just a piece I did I like cooking very much, so I thought of combining the two things I really love, which is drawing and cooking. And I'm going to make this is part of a recipe book that I plan to make of dishes I make myself, which are partly my inventions and partly stuff that I've learned. Okay, next. Next, Jessica? Yeah. And this is the last thing I want to share with you. It's a sort of semi-autobiographical thing about the kind of reactions that I get traveling on the Delhi metro about you know how in India people very respectfully will call you uncle. But it also is a way of putting you in your place. And so this was kind of inspired by that. Okay, next. Okay. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
That was magnificent, Uncle Orijit, and I say it with the utmost respect. Now, our next speaker, I've known David, I'm using his Chinese name because it's very rarely used in Vancouver, David Hoi Tin Wong, for nearly 20 years. He's one of the kindest, most honest people in Vancouver. He stands up for minorities. He has a long record of that, whether it's the First Nations people. He's been adopted by 4 or 5 First Nations. He was a witness at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was a documentary done about him on CBC by Duncan McHugh. David also stands up for the environment. He's fought to save the frogs. I met him when he was saving the trees at the Fraser View Golf Course, innumerable other causes. He stands up for the LGBT community, for seniors facing evictions in the downtown east side and in Chinatown. And he's also been a wonderful person in terms of bringing the life of the Chinese pioneers and the First Nations people historically who've helped build our province. And he also wrote a terrific illustrated book about the history of the Chinese in North America. It was called Escape to Gold Mountain. And did I also mention David's an architect? So he's a very talented person, and it's my great pleasure to invite David up onto the stage. So.
I don't know if I can live up to all that. It's all made up. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you, Indian Summer Festival. I don't know how I'm going to fall in the shoes of these 2 great artists. Amazing. Well, okay, I prepared a little movie. It's actually to go with my slideshow that I usually present to students. So I'm not going to talk about the actual presentation. I'm just going to let it run in the background while I just speak about some of the work that I've been involved with. As Charlie said, I am a Canadian fifth generation and very proud to be Canadian. And what I wanted to do was to figure out a way how to reach out to people about racism. And I've always thought that if I were to talk to people of my generation, it's almost a lost cause. It's not because they don't want to listen. It's because they're struggling to feed the family, to make sure the kids are looked after and just looking after everyday living. I felt the way to reach out about this difficult topic was to reach out to the young people. So after years of complaining and belly aching about why isn't that people think my family are new arrivals to Canada, when we've actually been in North America since the 1850s, that I get really upset when people say, why don't you go back to where you came from? So I finally figured out the way to do it is I'm going to try now to reach out to the young people. And I put my little architectural practice aside, and I thought that what I'm going to do is talk about things that maybe that would capture their attention. Comic books. First thing I did was I tried to reach out to people. This is a real report card, by the way. Right? And I don't think teachers do that anymore. They probably get fired, but this is when I was in grade 1, just being promoted to grade 2. So I want to talk about empathy. That little report card, I asked students, how many of you have difficulties in school, and how many of you actually, have a difficult time keeping awake and staying awake and all this other stuff. And what I want to show them was empathy, that I too was a young person at one time. So I remember growing up in Strathcona, the most difficult part was not getting in trouble. My grandparents would be working, my mom and dad would be working, and I was one of the most mischievous, most rotten, and I can tell you, I was a bad kid, really bad. I got in trouble all the time. So what happened was that my parents used to lock me up in the house because I would get in serious trouble all the time. I discovered this box of comic books from my Auntie Lynn. And Auntie Lynn had all these comic books, the Donald Ducks, the Archies, and all these great comic books, which I read and thoroughly digested until I'm stuck with these really boring comics that had this topic which I didn't really care about. It was written by it's called Classics Illustrated. How many here actually have seen Classics Illustrated comic books? Yeah, about a third? Great comic books. They took classic stories and translated into comic book form, comic books like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I remember picking up Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was the first time I realized that there's this dislike for people who were of African heritage. And I asked my auntie, Lynn, I go, hey, like what's going on here? And she said that, this slavery and things actually didn't happen that long ago. It happened here in North America. That's when I learned about comic books. Actually, is a great way to learn because I learned about ancient China through Marco Polo. I learned about the French Revolution, through A Tale of Two Cities. I learned about the Industrial Revolution through Oliver Twist and David Copperfield. All these interesting stories. So, of course, time goes by, and what happened? I get caught up, and I remember telling my parents that I want to become a cartoonist. So how many here have Asian parents who have high expectations? Come on, yes, I see here. Okay, hey, that's my son. He's putting up a hand there. Well, Mom and Dad would say, are you crazy? And they always say these Chinese words. I can't repeat them here, but, he said, no, you got to do something... like, you have to become a doctor, a dentist, or some of the other boring professions. And so I ended up becoming an architect. So I set up my architectural practice a number of years ago, and what had happened was that I spent all my waking hours trying to build the biggest and baddest architectural firm that I could. And I did okay. I did okay as an architect. Most of my work's outside Canada. And during that time, when I was... trying to build up my profile as an architect, my father would come up to me and say, David, it's time for us to go to see our ancestral village. Let's see all this neat heritage of ours. I would say to Dad, how about next year? And that would go on for a few years, and finally Dad passed away. And that was in 1999. And I felt really bad that I couldn't go to visit our ancestral village, if you can say that. And I had to make it up to my father, because there's something about the Chinese, psyche, that you had this thing for your heritage and for respect for your elders. I sold my firm in Singapore, of all places, and I came back to Vancouver. And I decided to talk about and finish my father's story. It was going to be a story about our family, about how we struggled from California, from the gold rush days, how we were almost exterminated because of the racism that occurred 100 years ago, and how we were pushed out of the U.S. and up the Northwest and end up in Victoria, and how we finally managed to come to Vancouver. So that's where the story started. And as I started the story, I realized that it's more than just my family. It's actually a common story shared by a lot of people coming to North America who weren't of a Anglo background. And it grew to become a story about the Chinese in Canada, and eventually a story about the Chinese in North America. The original story that I want to talk about was about our family, but I realized that it was more than just a story about the Chinese experience. It was a book about racism. And how do you reach out to young people and talk about boring and difficult topics? So that's what I did. I started to realize that this is a great medium to use graphic narrative to plant knowledge, as I call it that, small little snippets of history into the comic. And that's what I tried to do throughout my whole book, was actually insert small little things that people would see but didn't realize they're actually learning something. Like the Canadian flag, it used to be a British ensign with some other fancy details on how, and the American flag, how over the years it evolved, the number of stars and stripes on it, and names of people, and all these things. So it became a fun little project, and that's where it became a project of I guess more of love. I guess I can use that word. But that was my first mistake, was to do a comic book on history, because when I found out to do a book with a publisher, your facts had to be accurate. It's not as easy as just drawing something up and then realizing, let's draw this person up, eyeglasses, nice shirt, some nice words. I had to be historically accurate to the time period. It was really tough because I didn't know what type of glasses people wore in the 1890s, or if there were eyeglasses. The clothing, not just for the Western people, but also for people who came from Asia. All these little things drove me absolutely crazy. But more than that, the stories open up a lot of interesting things, because I think all of us love to somehow get our feelings out through swear words. And one of the things I discovered was a whole history of swearing. And I had all these wonderful swear words I dug up over, thanks to the internet. I found those wonderful swear words and I peppered them throughout my story. But the problem was that the publisher says, we can't use this language, right? It's wonderful language. And I was really frustrated. So what I did later on, and they didn't know this, was that I took away the neat little words that I found in the English language, but translated some of the Chinese swear words and left it in there, right? And they didn't know that. So for those of you of Chinese ancestry, you may be able to pick them out, and that's my little tongue-in-cheek humor to get back at my publisher, right? But what's really interesting, if I may say, about this story, if you like, you can repeat this slideshow. I made it really quickly because I didn't know how much time I would have. One neat thing was that when I presented during my book tour, I went down the west coast of North America, down towards California, and it was really interesting because some of the people in the audience, non-Asians, would sit there and they're all ready to attack me. One guy came up to me, this big American guy in Portland. He said, David, I'm really sick and tired of having to apologize for the wrongs that our ancestors did to your people, right? And then I said, well, you know, it's not really for us. I said, you know, for Caucasians. I said, for people who actually of my heritage, the Chinese. So he goes, what do you mean? I said, one of the things that I find really troublesome in Vancouver is that a lot of the migrants to Canada of Chinese ancestry, they take things for granted. They have an expectation and what's the word? A sense of entitlement of what we have here today. They don't realize how difficult it was to earn the respect that we have today. And it breaks my heart when I hear that the racism, it's really so subtle that you don't see it. And a lot of racism I experience right now is actually the Chinese towards our Aboriginal peoples. It's never, you know, people in the mainstream don't know or hear about it, but, you know, the so-called proclaimed leaders in the Chinatown community, we hear it all the time. I hear it all the time. Because Chinatown's so close to the downtown east side, and they're blaming our Aboriginal people for their problems. So these are things I want to reach out and tell them that, you know, this is actually, it's not just the whites against the Chinese, it's all of us. And I feel that the way to create a better world is to reach out to the young people, because they are moldable in terms of we can teach them. I think graphic novels is a way that we can reach out. So this gentleman from Portland who's quite upset at me originally, and I said that, you know, it's about sharing a story, the common story we have where my relatives, my ancestors fought for Canada and gave their lives up so that we can be full Canadian citizens. And same in America. So he heard that, and he was really happy, and he bought a couple of my books. Right? And there's so much out there. And just yesterday, I had lunch with a professor from UBC Okanagan. She teaches a course on racism in her sociology class, and she's informing me that these are master students. They're adult students, and they were quite insulted when she used this book, my graphic novel, as one of the books that they were going to study. And she was actually informed that this is such a juvenile approach to this topic, this difficult topic. And she's going to do a little, I guess she's going to write an article about it. But apparently, at the end of the course, the people there who thought they knew so much about Canadian history and the North American history had no clue about the horrific acts that were committed against people of identified ethnic backgrounds, the Chinese or South Asians and the Japanese. And sure, we can always complain about the battle past, and we say we can learn about it. But I think there's more than just learning about it. We can do something. And that's why I did my comic book. I'm also asked many times, so, you know, why should we be nice and what's in it for us? And that's what I think we should understand, that the most powerful thing for human beings is the mind. I'm asked as an architect, why is it that you did a graphic novel? Because it's a creative expression. Creativity comes from ideas. And when I explain to people that the most important thing to create innovation is through diversity. Diversity of peoples, of ideas, of everything. So I ask this question to all of you. What's so unique about the Pacific Northwest? What's happened in recent history, in the past 100 years, that's happened nowhere else on this planet? Have you heard of Amazon, Starbucks, Boeing Airline, Apple Computer, Microsoft? I can go on. Why did it happen in this part of the world and nowhere else? Because it's a fusion of ideas, of peoples, of cultures. We all come together because it's a young culture. We share our ideas, and we accept peoples for who they are and what they are. And that's wonderful because it's like an incubation for innovation. And that's why I say, here's what's in it for your children. Because if we embrace each other's culture and for who they are, we all stand to benefit as human beings. So I think my time is up. And I just want to close by saying one thing, very powerful statement made by this gentleman, Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was murdered by some racists during his, I think, the night before he got married in Detroit. He was an auto worker, and as he was celebrating in a restaurant, some of the auto workers came up to him and said, you effing Jap, you stole our job. And they took a baseball bat and they bashed in his head and killed this poor guy. And this is Vincent Chin, who's a Chinese American. His mom said one thing in which he was trying to find justice. And she said that, although our skin colors may appear to be different, our hearts are all the same. So I want all of us to realize that, it's within our ability to reach out to the next generation through whatever abilities you have, to teach them and to share with them that we are all one. Thank you.
Grab a seat. Okay.
Thanks, David. That was a wonderful presentation. Now, if I could invite Michael and Orijit up on stage, and the three of you can chat about each other's art, and we can learn some more. And I do recommend David's book. It is an excellent history. We all have microphones here at the side of so you can pull out the mics. Oh, okay. And maybe I will start by offering each of you an opportunity to ask a question or a comment on the other's art or presentation. So, Orijit, you can start, and if there's anything you wanted to ask, or if you're curious about anything, the floor is yours. You just hold it like this, like an ice cream cone.
Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to ask Michael, when you kind of thought of creating this sort of mural, which is also little narratives within it, with that it forms a book, and then it can come together to form one complete piece.
Keep it under here. Yeah.
How did you think of that? Because I'm really fascinated by this idea of something which is complete in itself as a singular complete piece, and at the same time is a multitude of self-standing little stories or images, which is something I found really very, very, very fascinating. This is something in a different way I did with the Punjab mural as well.
You can use this one. Oh, you got it.
I'm my family's been making art for a long time. We had my great-grandfather's exhibit at the Vancouver Art Gallery, Charlie Eden Shaw, and my uncle's got pieces at the Vancouver airport. And so I come from a family that's much about art and makes our living out of art.
Do you want to say who that uncle is?
Oh, Bill Reed was adopted by my grandmother, my great-grandmother's sister. Don't get Heida's talking about genealogy, because we just go deep there. It's a way of
Just
keeping our mind exercised, right?
Is one of the most famous artists in Canada.
Yeah. I've seen his work, unfortunately, little bits at the museum. And
But my concern is that the representation of Indigenous peoples in Canada has been very superficial, and one of the constant themes is that it is to make us, or to see us through a lens where we're denied the right to be humans, the right to be just like anyone else. So we are savages sometimes. We are the other end of the scale is creators of monumental art. And somewhere in the middle, regular people in the community who make their life maybe putting food on the grocery shelves or sweeping the floor or working for wages are lost. And it seems to me that in my grandparents' time, this is a long way around. I'll try to get to point. But in my grandparents' time, they refused to teach my mother how to speak Haida because they said it's too difficult to be an Indian person in Canada. And because at that point, the measure of what was accomplished and good was an Indigenous person who had left their culture behind to become a Canadian. Well, now it's changed. Now, today, we're supposed to be able to speak our Indigenous languages and participate in all these cultural rituals, and if we don't, we're somehow not up to the measure. Now, what's constant about that situation is the ground rules are always shifting. We're never able to actually achieve a good place to be seen as human people. This is meandering, but I'm concerned about that, so I wanted to create a monumental work, as much as the work made in the family are monumental scales, but I also wanted to break it down for people to have points of access to it, because sometimes we come up to a great Haida sculpture and we get very quiet because we're in a spiritual place and we have to act in a particular way. Well, maybe so, but as you know, some of those stories are pretty naughty. You know, they're about sort of sexual relationships between different species and things like that. But somehow or other, that's not part of the picture of what constitutes a Haida. And I will say, damn it, we fart like everybody does, you know? We're humans, right? And I'm concerned that the reason why we had residential schools and day schools and all the assaults and the smallpox epidemics is because we have never seen as human. So I'm going to try and get to this scale of breaking it down. What makes this monumental totem pole so powerful is not its scale, but it's the way the small pieces fit together. It's an examination of the flow. It's the relationship between the little things that actually make the big thing work. So I was trying to play around with that notion on scales. But essentially, I'm trying to find a way to make the individual have a point of connection and access to something that is presented as grand and monumental. I better stop there.
Sounds like the Punjab mural.
Great. yeah, that's in a sense, yes.
Yeah. Now, David, it's your opportunity now to ask Orijit a question or make a comment.
Well, you know.
Yeah, you just hold it up like an ice cream cone.
Okay, so I'm going to ask questions like, you know, in our cultures, it's very difficult to become an artist in terms of, you know, feeding a family. So I'm looking at your art; it's incredible. You got a fan. I think the whole audience of fans. I'm just going to ask a question. You know, how did you manage to balance a life of art with, and I don't know how to do it because you know, this is one of the things that was drilled into my head. You can't become an artist, David, you know, fine artist, because it's not a real job. Yeah. And I know that especially over in Asia, you know, the people who are artists, they struggle. So I'm just blown away by your artwork.
Thank you. Well, yes, I mean, my parents thought I was going to be a doctor. And when I started kind of trying, I used to draw as a kid. I used to always keep drawing. So at one point, my mother said, you know, you like drawing, and if you be a doctor, you have to study anatomy and botany. You have to draw plants and things. And so I said, okay, that sounds good. I'll be a doctor. And then I realized that this was all a big hoax. And you know, when I grew a bit older, so then I had to actually, I used to tell you honestly, I used to perform quite well in class, whatever. I mean, you know, be diligent about my studies and all that. But then I realized that if I keep doing that, I'll never get to be an artist because I'll end up being a doctor. So, and so I started doing badly. I started bunking school. I became a bad boy. So at the end, my parents had no option. They said, okay, go to design school because you're not going to get in anywhere else. So really, it had to. It was like that.
Pays to be naughty, eh? You didn't hear that.
Orijit, I thought, like, your art is so incredible, and I was wondering who your inspirations were And if there were any that kind of led you down this path?
Lots over the years. The first one was, that I can remember, was a Bengali artist from Shantiniketan called Nandalal Bose. He illustrated a Bengali primer for children written by Rabindranath Tagore with his woodcuts. Fantastic, such powerful. I remember each one in my head, even 45 years later. That was the first time. And my mother, we used to live outside of Bengal, so she was very concerned that we wouldn't learn to read and write Bengali. We'd speak it at home, but reading and writing, we'd learning English and Hindi. So she used to sit with us to teach us Bengali writing with that primer. And I used to spend all my time looking at the pictures. And in the end, I became an artist. I never really learned to write Bengali very well, but because of that primer, I became an artist.
You learned how to draw it.
So starting from there, and there's so many. I mean, it's a little difficult to list them all.
Okay. So, Michael, do you want to ask David a question about any aspect of what he's been doing?
Yes, I guess it's a question for all of us here, and it's a question as well for the audience to consider. One of the streams that I see, and you spoke very clearly to it, David, but I'm seeing it, and I want to look deeper into it, is what's the role of hybridity in our work, in our expression, given that we are presented in a flawed but purist way. You know, where oh, you're a Haida, therefore you're this. Oh, you're Chinese, therefore you're this. All these kind of Reader's Digest condensed simplistic versions of who we are as complex people. And you spoke very lovingly to and made the point about Microsoft and all these corporations that come out of hybridity, I would think. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. I think it's a critical point.
Well, thank you, Michael. You know, politicians always think there's a way to create an economy, as they call it, by artificially creating things, but they don't value what we have up here. And that's a strength. And when we talk about hybridity, they don't see the value because no one's ever showed them what really comes out through what they want to call as, they call it diversity or multiculturalism here in Canada. But there's more than that. They don't understand the value behind this. We need to have leaders that have good advisors that explain to them why it's important for us to have this fusion of people and ideas. You know, we look at biodiversity. We look at the value that comes into medicines, keeping things alive, because we never know what comes out at the end. We don't know if this little bug down this, or little frog. I love frogs. This little frog will create a brand new medicine 50 years from now. We don't know that. But if we don't try, we won't know. So when we talk about hybridity, right, we've got to explain somehow to our elected officials, elected leaders, that it's important for us to nurture each other, not by demanding us to be nice to each other, by saying, racism hurts. I mean, we know that. And they have these stupid commercials, spend tons of money, put these commercials out and say racism hurts. But they don't tell people what's in it for us. Because unfortunately, people are almost selfish in the sense that, really, what's in it for us? You tell them, what's in it for us? Well, our children, the future of our children, that's what's in it, because we can be really, really great as human beings. And that's what ends hybridity, if we can call it that, that the fusion ideas. And it applies across the many disciplines.
Yeah, there's an interesting book on that topic, actually, Michael. Leonie Sandercock, who's a UBC planning professor, wrote a book called Mongrel Cities, and it was about how the cities we are becoming. But she could have called it hybrid cities, but the mongrel dog is very strong, and so that was what. And she looked at it from planning perspective, and it's very intriguing. So, David, it's now your opportunity to ask Michael a question.
Be nice. Be nice.
Be nice.
Simple question.
Well, I was as an architect. I remember I was trying to do a thesis thing. This is many, many years ago, and we're looking at the architecture of the post and beam and how it goes back to Chinese post and beam architecture. And I look at that, and I'm just curious. When I speak to my First Nations friends, they all believe in a creation of a greater spirit that comes, that it actually comes from, how do I say this now? The culture spawned from Turtle Island, from North America. Right? I don't know where I'm going with this question, but what I'm trying to say is that do you actually see a lot of the similarities between, I guess, Chinese art and culture with First Nations art and culture, and specifically Haida work?
Okay, thank you. That is not the easy question. I was hoping to be something like, are you having a good day? And I would say yes, and then Charlie would step in. The two things I want to talk to, sorry, one is the primary connection that I see between this part of the world, Haida, and Asia is Japan. And that's because of my own family history when it was a particularly difficult time to be a person of color here. Japan was actually a refuge for Haidas who were working on sailing ships. And as a matter of fact, one of my ancestors went over. He had a wife. She was not a pleasant person to live with. And he was happy to go out on these sailing ships for 6 months. And he never came back once. And his brother, Jimmy Harris, was worried that the family honor would be offended, and he went to Japan to find George. George had fallen in love with a Japanese woman in Hokkaido and Hakodate, and he wasn't coming home. So Jimmy Harris got him drunk, shanghaied him, and brought him back to Masset. So this is a big story in the family, and I want to go to Japan to say maybe I've got some relatives there. But so Japan, there was this relationship, close relationship. Let me use the opportunity to talk about the houses, because as an architect you may be interested. The houses, the Haida houses, which are essentially 4 posts, corner posts, and a set of beams, and in the middle of the house there's a smoke hole. It's called the glimmet, and right down below it is the fire pit. The house is actually engineered to reflect a cosmic map. The front of the door always faces the ocean. And consider for a moment how you're all sitting in this way, side by side, and you're looking this way. In a village, this would be the same template we use for the house, where the doorway of the house faces the ocean, because this is where creativity comes from. And our life only begins once we enter into the door of the house, because the house becomes ourselves. And the heart of the house is in the center. And when we die, as regular people do, we will take the walls apart at the back of the house, and we will have our body will be packed out, because from creativity through the life in the house and then to death behind us in the forest. Now, if we're a person who is much concerned about spiritual matters, when we die, instead of having the house taken apart and our body taken out the back door, some of the people will climb up on top of the house and lower ropes, and our body will be tethered to these ropes, and our body will be pulled up, because that's representing a whole nother vector, if you will. And that's the world has 10 levels stacked above them and below us. And below us are fishes and whales, and particularly we're interested in creatures that can fly and be in the trees and can also dive in the water, because they have this power to go through the different worlds. So here is the world, a cosmic thread perhaps, and then there's this other one which is creative thread. The other one, my friends, is the one that you share with the people sitting next to you. On each side of us, we have this social thread. In our life, our center, our balance in the house is our very center of ourselves. And it's when we find ourselves in proper relationship to creativity, to society, and to other creatures. And so the house itself reminds us, and who knows, chicken or egg, it doesn't matter to me, but it reminds us it's a tool, a teaching tool.
Pretty heavy, man.
One of the things
we could have gone for, are you having a good day? And I could have said yes.
Orijit, I wanted to ask you about when you go to India, for many of the people here who've been to India, it's almost chaotic, and you see the hoardings, and we saw your posters, and I look at Vancouver, and it seems quite antiseptic in comparison. And do you want to comment about how the kind of public art culture in India can either shape the political world, or what you see, even compare and contrast what you see in Vancouver and maybe in Delhi or in other Indian cities.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obvious. I mean, that's one of the really strong contrasts that I experience on the streets of Vancouver and Delhi. I guess, I mean, like other, cities in Europe or America, Vancouver is highly designed. It's highly systematized and highly designed, and therefore, what happens is, I would say, there can almost be a kind of oppressiveness of design, because everything is so. In India, there's a lot more, in cities like Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, there's a lot more kind of spontaneous art created by not people who already know the rules of composition and typography and color and etc. etc. So the results can be very unexpected and very diverse, and the cities kind of accommodate. Now I'm talking only at the level, of course, of visual art and graphics. I mean, what we were. So I mean, this could also apply in a broader sense, but I'm referring to this particular aspect. And so there is a kind of a diversity of expression and opinion, which makes it is innately more somehow more political, because it's not mediated. It kind of bursts forth in all sorts of forms, and so yes, there is a space for that highly aestheticized and designed kind of imagery and graphics and all of that, but also there is very wide range. I mean, this is at one end of it, and then there's the complete.
I'm just wondering what the cost is for us in Vancouver when you have such a systematized, as you say, approach to the public space.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects,
is it a cost in democracy?
Definitely. I mean, I think there is a kind of spaces which are designed also define how you. I think David, as an architect, would definitely understand that when you design a particular space, you also dictate how it's to be used, and who can use it, and in what way they can interact with it. And while spaces that are claimed, I mean, the streets of Delhi and Bombay are full of claimed spaces. People who claim it are maybe temporarily occupying that space, or maybe struggling to keep that space, might get thrown out tomorrow. But in that process, there is always you cannot sort of you can't be obedient in a space like that. The space itself demands disobedience. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay, now it's your opportunity to ask either of the panel any questions that might be on your mind, or any comments about what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, David, I haven't had the chance to look at your book in great depth, but I really like the way you've kind of, it's obviously in some ways an architect's eye, because I can see the sort of perspectives and the way you kind of choose a particular angle of view and things like that. I mean, do you think that kind of storytelling in through images? I mean, where does your sort of perspective on how language and your because as I was mentioning, I mean, I'm particularly kind of fascinated by geography, by location, by space, and the meaning of that space itself in which something. Some event occurs, which I might depict in my story or whatever. But the space, or what would normally be called the background, is to me sometimes more important than the foreground, than the characters who are in the foreground. So, I mean, do you see that? I mean, I'm interested because I would think that as an architect you're very concerned with space and with geography and so on.
Orijit, well, you're right, because when I talk about space, the most difficult thing about an illustrated narrative is to engage your reader and create that wonder. What's going to happen next? Sort of lead them. So you sort of purposely structure your images, and there might be a shadow behind a wall, and you know that something's going to happen. That anticipation. I'm new at this. I'm a baby in terms of doing graphic novels. I got 2 masters here, and I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at. I saw yours. You got beautiful. You're looking at your angles, looking up, and it creates drama, and it accentuates, and exaggerates the mood and these things. And I found that I haven't learned that yet, so I'm going to study, maybe work on another graphic novel. But as an architect, I love drawing buildings, and for me, the background in my stories, I had a lot of fun doing in the beginning because I had more time. I felt that I had a few years to work on it, so I spent a bit more time creating the backgrounds in my story. Towards the end, I realized I ran out of time, so the background suffered, right? So that's one thing I talk about reality. This is what happened. But as an architect, I haven't learned the really good techniques of expressing, using the background to really tell the story. But you're right; it's absolutely very powerful because there's one image that sticks in my head. I think there's a graphic novel called The Listener, or whatever it is. And it's a person standing at the door, and the light from behind this person casts a long shadow of this person standing at the door. And it creates mystery, intrigue, and all that sort of stuff. And it's just a very simple black and white image. And that's it. It's the art of understanding backgrounds.
Well, David will have an opportunity, as will everyone in the room after we're through, to buy Orijit's books and the others, the other panelists as well, out in the lobby. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you just to make closing statements of a minute if there's any final thoughts you have, and I'll start with you, David.
Well, I talk about diversity and biodiversity, and again, we have to sort of understand what it is that we're all talking about all the time, because we're talking about difficult topics, racism and things like that, and it's really hard to convey these messages to people who really have not experienced some of these things. So I don't know how to express this, but you can't say empathy and things like that. But all I'm trying to say is that we have within each of us the ability to share knowledge, and I want to encourage all of you to sit down at the table, ask your children, your grandchildren, to ask your elders in the family, why did you come to North America, to Canada? What were their stories? What were their backgrounds? Because through that simple process, we start talking, and I think that there's an appreciation for the younger generation to understand there's more to life than just television and internet things. So I just want to encourage more dialogue around the dinner table. If that's of anything, it's a story that's important.
Okay. Michael?
What I've wanted to explore with Red is challenging the notion, and I think this speaks to the situation of how institutionalized or controlled the societies are in North America, where the specialty tasks of engineering the spaces we live in is not our own. Somebody else will tell us what is our relationship to our space. And I see that in comic books or graphic novels where there's these very clear rectangular spaces, and everything that's important in the story takes place within those spaces. And so with Red, I wanted to say, no, they're true that those spaces are important to us, but they happen within the context of a bigger world that happens around us. We're part of a bigger process. And so in Red, sometimes the lines between the panels, which we call the gutters, sometimes they're very thin. And other times they get huge, and sometimes the pictures become submerged in these events, just like we become submerged in events in our society or in the world. And I wanted to examine a way to honor the fact that we have relationships to one another and to things that actually are bigger than us, where they really speak to our own personal insignificance. And so that's what I've been playing with in red. Just one final note. I'm concerned that in our society we become so specialized that we are no longer responsible for ourselves or for our community. And that is the striking and dangerous characteristic of a democracy, which says, become engaged, but please only once every 4 years. And then once you're out of the ballot box, get back into line. I think we need to be very alert as citizens that our role and responsibility is to stay engaged with the world around us.
Thank you. And Orijit?
I think Michael just took the words out of my mouth.
Okay.
You want your speaking notes back?
Okay. Well, on behalf of the Indian Summer Festival on SFU, which is where we are right now, and on unceded Aboriginal territory, I want to thank all three of our speakers, David Wong, Michael Yahgulanaas, and Orijit Sen, and they'll be out in the lobby. And there's another event to follow, which will be Zarka Nawaz, who created Little Mosque on the Prairie, is coming next in here with Anita Mazumdar. So that should be a terrific event as well. And I'll pay a final tribute to Hari Sharma and the Hari Sharma Foundation, because I'm a great admirer of Hari Sharma, and I'm sure many people in the room are as well. So thanks again for coming, and I hope you continue to enjoy the festival.